life is no thrill. It's worse than nil. So draw the right conclusion. Let them be still.
Welcome to episode number 85 of the Exploring Antinatalism Podcast, a podcast showcasing the wide range of perspectives and ideas throughout antinatalism as it exists today, through interviews with antinatalists and non-antinatalist thinkers, creators of all kinds. Now running 5 years strong, I'm your host, Amanda Sukenick, and today I'm speaking with Associate Professor of English and Literature, coordinator of an animal rights studies center, and the co-producer and co-presenter of a Turkish radio show, Right to Life of Species, the Turkish translator of both David Benatar's Better Never to Have Been, The Harm of Coming into Existence, and The Human Predicament, A Candid Guide to Life's Biggest Questions, Cansu Özge Özmen. Welcome, Cansu, to the Exploring Antinatalism Podcast. It's an honor to have you with me on the show today. Cansu, your name has been floating around in my world for really quite a long time now. I know that you had been the translator of the Turkish edition of both Better Never to Have Been and The Human Predicament, but it was not until you and I and a host of other antinatalists were recently featured in Elizabeth Barber's Harper's Magazine article, The Case Against Children Amongst the Antinatalists, that I truly came to realize that you are not just simply the translator of these antinatalist works, but an antinatalist yourself, and a fabulously fascinating one at that. So I'm so excited to get the chance to speak with you today. We have so much to talk about, but let's perhaps start with, who is Cansu?
Honor is all mine. First of all, thank you, Amanda, for having me. I was born in Istanbul. I'm 41. I studied American literature in Turkey and then in Germany, where I lived for 5 years. And then I came back to Turkey, and I've been teaching literature at a state university for the last 14 years. I've been vegan for the last 9 or 10 years, and I live with 5 cats and 3 dogs, all former strays. That's me in a nutshell.
Fantastic. I didn't realize we were the same age. Awesome. Cansu, why are you or are you not an antinatalist?
I am an antinatalist. I don't think, like many other people, I can point to an antinatalist epiphany. It must have happened gradually, but I believe our stories of how we became antinatalists are important, because pronatalists who are particularly defensive against antinatalism seem to have a lot of preconceived ideas about why people become antinatalists. I think it's useful to show antinatalists too, like any other, is a diverse group. One of the preconceived notions I have an issue with, I have many, but one of them is the idea that antinatalism is like a trauma response, which it can be. It would be perfectly understandable for people to go through a traumatic experience and then decide, for fear of what might happen to their children if they actually were brought into existence, and decide not to have them. That's something I completely understand. But I think it's important to note that one can and does become an antinatalist without going through major trauma firsthand. I've been very fortunate and privileged in many ways. My parents are wonderful people, and since I somehow had to exist, I'm glad I exist as their child. Obviously, any other way would have not have been possible. I think it's usually misleading when one retrospectively tries to pinpoint a moment of becoming an antinatalist. I think it's the same with becoming vegan or falling in love. Like when you ask someone, when did you actually fall in love? Some people romanticize it and say it's at that very moment when he pulled my chair or whatever. But I think it's revisionist in a way, and it's mostly not true. I assume for all of them, there should already exist some predisposition in the person. And this predisposition should rely on their observations and experiences. I would say my predisposition certainly relied on observations of the lives of others rather than my own experiences. From what I can remember, some particularly painful memories include watching animals in zoos when we went to visit zoos when I was a child. Stray dogs being hurt on the streets, because in Turkey we have always had stray animals. A man committing suicide by jumping out of his building next to my school when I was a child. So many others like this. Things I saw on television, a policeman burning to death, things that I would not wish on any sentient being. Basically, these are, although they are traumatic experiences for people, and it's a secondhand trauma for me, but basically they are everyday occurrences, which did not seem to deter the majority of people from having more children or being happy, for that matter. I wouldn't want to give the impression that I was particularly sensitive or more empathetic than other people, because I don't think I am. But I thought, and I still think, that I could see things as they are. And I think I'm more realistic about how much things can actually improve. Another preconceived notion people seem to have, and I have an issue with, is the belief that antinatalists are miserable people. And I think they might rightfully be, by the way. There are certainly enough possible reasons to be miserable. But it doesn't follow from that all antinatalists are miserable. I certainly have had and continue to have more good moments than bad ones in my life. If we were able to somehow quantify them, I believe my life experience would overall come out positive. At least that has been my feeling of it, and that's what matters, even if I'm fooling myself. But that doesn't mean I have the right to risk it for anyone else, particularly my child.
Absolutely beautiful said all around. I'm so glad that there's so many of the misconceptions that you laid out there that I'm so glad that you addressed. I mean, the idea of antinatalism as a trauma response. Listen, I do think that there is evidence, if we look at the community as a whole, of people coming to this sort of conclusion through that. I do think that there are people that do call themselves antinatalists who are responding to their trauma, and that's maybe that's where some people start. I've also seen evidence of that, where it starts as sort of a depressive episode, or it starts as a trauma response, and then it grows, it changes. But these are very important misconceptions to debunk, because I think, as you were saying, basically the vast majority of us, I would say, are antinatalists because we're making an assessment of the world. We're seeing reality. We're seeing the things that happens to sentient beings, and that is what's bringing us to this conclusion. And that's an incredibly important thing for natalists that that have that knee-jerk reaction, as you were speaking about, to come to understand that. I think that some of that may dissipate as time goes on, like as we're increasingly all over the world. It's you can't just this picture, this portrait that people like to paint of all antinatalists being depressed. And I know so many happy antinatalists. I mean, I do. As time goes on, I find more and more people that report to live very happy lives, and yet are as hardcore antinatalists as you can get. So I think that mold that people have built around us is starting to shatter, which is great, because this is there's in my opinion, there's no more important idea to sort of be normalized, than this one. So thank you for expressing all of that. I think your contribution in Elizabeth Harper's magazine article really stood out and moved me a great deal, and I was just so extremely impressed by your bravery and honesty in voicing your desire to have children, and yet choosing not to, for ethical reasons. This is such a rarity expressed among antinatalists, in large part because women in general are so rare within the community. And I'd like to talk and ask you a lot about that subject in particular, but may I ask first, how did you come to be involved in Elizabeth's article?
I think Professor Benatar referred her to me, and Elizabeth wrote to me and asked me if I wanted to contribute, and I was more than happy to, of course.
Okay. I love that. That's the story. Excellent. I know it's an extremely sensitive topic, and I don't take asking you about it lightly at all. But would you mind talking a little bit about your desire to have children and how you came to the ethical decision not to?
Yeah, well, it is sensitive, I guess, but I really don't mind talking about it. because I think it's important to share, at least some of us, if we are not uncomfortable with it, to share our stories of how we came to this decision. Because one realizes, it goes with every kind of story, really. Once we share our stories, it becomes clear how many of us there actually are than we thought. Because, we're not that unique, although we are the minority, we're not that unique. I don't remember always wanting to have children, when I was much younger, but I knew mostly because I was a bit boyish myself. I really liked boys. Most of my childhood friends were boys. And if I have ever had a child, I had this like magical thinking kind of that I would have a boy. I always liked reading coming of age stories of boys, mostly because there were more coming of age stories of boys than of girls, really. So I had a very romantic way of thinking about it. Then I got married in my late 20s. I kind of felt a strange urge to have a child. I became fascinated with pregnancy. I know many people, even pronatalists, don't really like hearing all the details about pregnancy. Some people are even disgusted with pregnancy and birth. But of course, it was also because some of my close friends were having children in our late 20s. I would watch their bellies grow and speak to their unborn children. And whenever I encountered a pregnant animal, I would touch their bellies and feel the movement of their babies. And I love the smell of babies of all species, all of them, particularly babies of cows, like calves, and human babies too, of course, and kittens. Anyway, but I'm all for spaying and neutering, obviously. But if there are babies, then I will definitely smell those babies. But newborns also always made me cry. At first, I couldn't really understand why, but then I realized it was because of their cluelessness and their innocence. They didn't know what was going to happen to them. And it kind of made me very sad because human babies particularly are very, very helpless, right? When they're born, for a very long time. So the more suffering I witnessed, the more I became convinced that world was not a particularly friendly place or a safe place, and I would not be able to have a biological child with a clear conscience. So I knew however much I devoted myself to keeping him safe, and I would, obviously, but I would never be able to protect him from all the potential horrors that he might be exposed to. And I would also always feel ultimately responsible for any pain he would suffer through. And indeed, I would be ultimately responsible, even if he did not face any major tragedy, as I had not until then. In my late 30s, I was diagnosed with cancer, which is a kind of a major tragedy. But then I had no major tragedies. I didn't lose anyone, I didn't see death firsthand. But then I was also thinking that whatever happened, even if his life was ideal, he would eventually have to confront his own mortality, and he would fear death, and he would die. And I guess it's sort of a realization of not being omnipotent. And I think we walk around thinking that this is the case for at least a part of our lives. And this is a natural conclusion to reach when one realizes how little control one has over their own life, really. So you might continue to resist this idea, and many people spend their lives resisting this idea, but the mere fact of your resistance proves its existence in a way, kind of like death, right? We're constantly in denial, but, well, there it is. It's something that we deny. So, of course, there are many stages between knowing and understanding and acting on it. But whether you're resisting an idea or whether you're embracing this lack of control, it must reflect on your behavior. And in my case, inaction about having children. This is in a way similar to the risk argument. But whatever risks there would be, if you actually had the power to foresee them and forestall them, you could justify taking the risk. But I don't. One might say, what are the chances? Horrible things happen to very few people, which might or might not be true. I think it's irrelevant. It might have been an acceptable response if I was actually taking the risk for myself, which we do take risks for ourselves. We might be self-destructive, but this choice might not be considered immoral if we are doing it to ourselves. But once we are taking these risks, however small they are, on someone else's behalf, regardless of whether or not that someone is your child, then it becomes morally relevant. I mean, when you ask parents, they always tell you they believe their children deserves the best, and they might get the best. They might provide them with the best conditions, but that is the best that is available in existence. And to me, I mean, it might sound a bit narcissistic, I'm not sure, but this is not good enough for my child. And I don't think I should settle for this. I have, of course, throughout the years, I have thought about it in many ways, in many aspects. And many people talk about love for children or animals in a way that sounds kind of impossible to me, because loving a group categorically somehow does not strike me as genuine. I'm mentioning it because people usually cite love for children as a reason to have children. I think this is one of many ways children are being objectified, because childhood is one period of life. Children grow, and adulthood, although it is not the period when you are responsible of taking care of your child anymore, actually lasts longer than a childhood. So you actually have to love adults to have children, which is, again, I think impossible categorically. And if you express love for a group, similarly to when you express dislike for a group, it means you do not consider them as individuals. I think the sense of not treating children as individuals begins with this alleged love for the whole group of them. And I mean, I can't articulate it properly, but I think it continues after the child is born, because I don't think children are respected enough in various ways when they are growing up. This is, of course, not directly relevant to our discussion, but I see some kind of connection between this sense of entitlement. This has been the key word for me, like entitlement of having children, their reasons for doing so, and their treatment of the child. I think there's a continuity between them. So the reason I wanted to have a child is not because I loved children, because I don't believe one can love each child one meets. Just like animals, I mean, you can respect their right to life. You can be just towards them, but love, I'm not really sure. I mean, if there are people out there who can love every creature they meet, I mean, this is wonderful. It's just, I find it hard to believe, but maybe it is possible. But I decided not to have a child because I know I'm capable of feeling unconditional love, because I've felt it before. And I believe the greatest sacrifice you can make for someone you love unconditionally is to disregard your desires and interests and prioritize theirs. And I really wished there was a way out of this. I thought about it a lot. Like I read all kinds of counter arguments to antinatalism, but I personally wasn't convinced by any one of them. But still, I do understand why people have children. I mean, there are many surveys of why they do. Obviously, they're all self-centered reasons. But what I sympathize with the most, I think, is the hope that things will get better, that nothing terrible is going to happen to their children, that they will be there to protect them until they're self-sufficient adults. And even if their children do suffer, their pain will make them grow and become better people and more mature people. And when they're in their deathbed, their child will be there with them, alive and healthy. They will say their goodbyes. And their child, similarly, will dodge all the disasters and become a wise old person, and so on and so forth. And I do sincerely wish this for everyone who decide to have children. But I think, at least, I mean, from my perspective, there are enough reasons to fear this might not be so for the majority of people who are born. however ideal your circumstances now might be, you will never know what harms he will be exposed to. And of course, I understand something else, that child bearers have this sort of unbearable lightness of belonging to the majority, so to speak. Everyone else is doing it, so it can't be so bad. But lots of evil have been done, particularly for this reason. And I just could not bring myself to be a part of it. And as a note, if I was listening to someone like myself, I would want to know why I did not adopt or foster. I think it's important to address this question because I'm 100% pro-adoption for people who would like to fulfill their child-rearing desires. And I know the costs, I think, deter many people from it in the US, but this is not the case in Turkey. There are, however, more children who are not in adoption status, but in fostering status. And I have always wanted to foster, and I was planning to do so. But I was diagnosed with breast cancer at 38, and the treatments were very long and painful, and I've had many operations, and now I have this constant fear of recurrence. So at least for now, I kind of postponed the idea. I mean, I know I'm getting old, but I think it's still possible if I come to a more comfortable state of mind. I just wanted to add this because I'm 100% pro-adoption for people who want to have children.
Such a candid and moving answer. Thank you so much. And I'm happy to hear that your diagnosis is hopefully in remission. I'm so sorry about that.
Yeah, I'm okay now. Thank you.
That's wonderful news. That's wonderful news. There's so much I wish to comment on that about things that you said, but the one thing I want to say is that really struck me. Well, first of all, there's some serious similarities between our childhoods and sort of that magical thinking. That's the thing that you said that really struck me the most. And in a sense, I think that what we see as antinatalists is evidence that people don't really grow up from that. You know, they learn sort of this magical thinking in childhood about life, about what it is to produce new people, and that's sort of a cement that never gets chipped away at throughout life, I think, for most people. But anyway, thank you so much for that answer. Like I was saying earlier, women in antinatalism are rare. There's been very little statistic data done on the antinatalist community. So in actual fact, it is possible that there are an equal number of men and women in antinatalism. But as far as what can be seen on the surface, it is primarily men that make antinatalist content and primarily men who create identities around antinatalism. Do you have any thoughts on why this might be?
Yeah. Maybe not original ones, but I do have some thoughts. I've also always been very curious about the demographics of antinatalism, not in terms of the gender divide, but about other things like religion, for instance, believers and non-believers, age. Yeah, I'm always curious too, but I haven't been able to find any detailed demographic studies
There's
either.
almost none.
Yeah. I can only speculate, of course, as to why men are more expressive about antinatalism. But my initial response is if men are more expressive about everything in general, then it will be a natural consequence of that they are more expressive about antinatalism. I think I once came across a survey in Reddit about the antinatalist community in Reddit, and around, I think, 65% were male and 35 was female. But then again, Reddit has more male users than female users. So I don't think we have reliable data. I think I can think about it, at least in the Turkish context, as to why women talk less about antinatalism. I know it's valid for the rest of the world too, but womanhood is relatively more closely associated with motherhood here. It is increasingly becoming more acceptable for women to remain child-free. I mean, I know that Turkey has become much more conservative in the last 20 years, but I mean, some movements you simply can't stop. I mean, it just you just move forward in some things. And the term voluntary childlessness has recently made it into literature in Turkey. There are even academic studies, a few academic studies done on being child-free and why women choose to be child-free. Most are, again, of course, about the prospective parent herself, not about the child. I have read the studies, but I haven't come across antinatalism as one of the reasons. So whether or not you can make an independent decision, of course, depends on your familial background, your cultural background. But some women here simply do not have a say in the matter of marriage or reproduction. Some women can't even choose who they're going to get married to, or when they're going to get married, or whether or not they can receive, further education after compulsory education. But if you do, and if you remain child-free for ethical reasons, I can imagine why some women might be reticent about voicing their opinions, because then you would not only be refusing to deliver what is expected of you by becoming a mother, but you would also be telling all the other women that they are doing something wrong. Essentially, I mean, sometimes it is hard to talk about antinatalism because that's basically what you're saying. Same with veganism too. You tell people that you're doing something wrong. That's why there are all kinds of new strategies people develop to talk about these things. So I guess it would here make you a pariah, and twice. On the other hand, I have one experience. I mean, it's anecdotal, but still it means something. I gave an interview to a political cartoonist about antinatalism last month, I think. And after it was published, 30 people reached out to me. 29 of them were women. And they were all thrilled to see that their feelings were being articulated in a way that made sense to them. And they were all very happy about the article. They just were not aware of the idea before that it had a name, but they also felt like they were antinatalist. There was only one man who reached out to me, and he said the interview sucked, and that additionally, it was all plagiarized from Schopenhauer. And of course, he was wrong. It might have sucked, but if there was any plagiarism, it would be from Professor Benatar, not from Schopenhauer, definitely. So in my experience, at least, I mean, in my narrow experience, women certainly seem interested in antinatalist ideas.
That's a fascinating reaction. I mean, I have to say, and I don't know the gender spectrum, but I have to say that every time I am a part of an interview or an article or something like that, you do see a pool of people come forward, be they men or women, who are like, I have been thinking these thoughts my entire life, and I'm so happy to finally have a word attached to it. Like I've seen that happen again and again and again. And that's always fascinating to see, and I always wonder about what the gender breakdown of that is. I'm curious if you wouldn't mind, I mean, telling going through some of your thoughts on some of these other demographics you mentioned earlier, like you were talking about age and religion, and that you often think about those sort of demographics within the antinatalist community. Do you want to talk about that at all?
Yeah, I've been wondering about, be fruitful and multiply. So, I mean, if you are a believer, would it be, I mean, it probably would be more challenging to be an antinatalist, at least voice that opinion in a religious community. And Turkey is predominantly religious. Not everybody practices Islam, like 100%. But they would, at least most of them would identify as Muslim. So, of course, one of the notions about religion is that you are encouraged to multiply so that there are more believers to your institutionalized religion, whichever that is. So my guess is that there would be fewer religious antinatalists. In terms of age, I mean, obviously, it depends on the distribution of pain and suffering in your life. if they're more intense in your 20s, then you might maybe become an antinatalist if it is just based on your observations, if it is based on secondhand trauma. But I believe some people do become antinatalists after they have children, after their 30s, because then they actually can empathize to the maximum of their ability with their children. I mean, it is one of the understandable reasons why one has children, because it is a chance to relive life and correct your mistakes and whatever. And you understand that is the person you can empathize with the most. And once you realize that there are certain problems in their lives that they are exposed to that might have been prevented if they had not come to life. So I encounter a lot of people who say that they really love their children, but they wish they had not brought them into existence. So I'm guessing later in life, more likely to become antinatalists than earlier in life.
Yeah, and I really don't know. I mean, once again, I just hope that I hope someone sees this and goes, you know what, it's time to start some actual statistical data collection on antinatalism, because I have met lots of antinatalists that have religious affiliation all over the map, really, across the board. Certainly, there's antinatalism in the history of religion. There's antinatalism and Gnosticism and the Talmud, and go on and on and on. And I've met antinatalists as young as maybe, and what by met I'm just have some association with online, extraordinarily young, maybe early teenagers to people in their 90s. But to what extent, we fall in all of these categories, it's really a huge mystery. So yeah, it's a buffet of research that needs to be done. I really do believe.
Do you have
sorry.
the demographical details of your subscribers by any chance? Can you see your subscribers, where they're mostly from? And
I have to be honest with you, it's been a while since I've looked at any of that. I know that the last time I looked at it, in terms of the gender breakdown, it showed 100% male, which can't be right. It can't be right. That was a while ago. But I'll have to. That's probably a good place for me to start. Actually, there was and I don't know how official it was. I don't. I think the researcher went under a pen name too. But there was and I think it was in 2017, there was the second issue of Antinatalism magazine, which was like a short-lived kind of community project spearheaded by Andreas Moss, and it was started by the late Juwoon Hung. And in that issue of the magazine was some statistical data that was collected through Reddit, and I think some of the Facebook groups. I'll have to share some. I'll scan those. I'll share those with you. I mean, it's fascinating, but it's very outdated, and it was only from a small collection of the community, and the community was much smaller back then too, to begin with. So that's all we've got so far. I really hope that that won't be where it ends. But thank you so much for all of your thoughts on all of that. I wonder if you might also have any thoughts on why antinatalism, at least at this time, hasn't entered into much feminist discourse. There is some. We have Patricia McCormack, who is, among other things, a feminist antinatalist philosopher. But then you also have instances like Christine Overall, who thinks that antinatalism is bad for women. In my mind, at least, this is a subject that should be at the forefront of feminism, and it's not. So do you have any thoughts on why this might be?
Again, I'll have to speculate, but I know at least in eco-critical feminist discussions, some ecofeminists are skeptical about issues regarding population control, because there's always the risk of undermining women's reproductive agency, and it also unjustly lays the blame for environmental problems on women in developing or underdeveloped countries. There might be different kinds of discriminations involved in it. So they are skeptical towards it. I suspect there might be similar considerations in mainstream feminisms too. It is a complex matter, and there are so many intersections to consider. Some might perceive antinatalism as an intervention on their reproductive freedom. After all, it suggests that the presumed intrinsic right to have children should be questioned. And it is, it seems like it's the most sacred right ever. And if the questioning is mostly done by men, as you pointed out, if the producers of knowledge about antinatalism is predominantly men, it might cause some resistance. Sort of like an all-male committee deciding on a health bill, which includes maternity services or something, it sometimes happens. They might also misconstrue it as paternalistic. I know what's good for you more than you know it yourself. But I hope the reaction does not stem from such superficial reasons, because, in fact, antinatalism is ultimately very non-discriminatory. It doesn't get more egalitarian than that, because it applies to all unborn children and all prospective parents, regardless of what group they might belong to or identify with. I don't see anything discriminatory in antinatalism at all, so I don't see why it should not become a part of mainstream feminist discussions in the future.
I 100% agree, and I agree with all of your suggestions on what might be preventing it. Some of the possible. Look, I do think that we're saying that the womb is dangerous. Like, I do think that actually is a part of what we're saying, or it could be a part of what we're saying. And I think that's a reasonable thing to say. And I do. I think genitals coming together and creating human beings is a dangerous thing. Whatever those genitals may be.
But they can come together. That's okay.
They can come together. They just got to do it safely. I'm all for them coming together as often and as much as possible. Very sex positive antinatalist, but I just so long as it doesn't come in the creation of new people. So, so I understand how that can be perceived as aggressive, and I think you're absolutely right that if so much of that is coming from men, that's definitely probably going to be a bit of an issue. But
I don't think that's a very grounded reason to resist the idea, because it's coming from men. Yeah.
But I do think that it's all the more reason why I think voices like yours are so important, because there's just so few. Again, there's just so few, and Patricia McCormack's, and there's just so few female antinatalists voicing this opinion. So, one more question on the gender divide. Again, there is this strange gender divide in antinatalism. There is, of course, also the child-free movement, which does primarily consist of women. It's sometimes seen as part of antinatalism, and then again, sometimes not. Do you have any thoughts specifically on the child-free movement, and maybe what that movement is doing right in terms of being attractive to women, but maybe doing wrong in terms of not being attractive to men? What is it? Why is it that antinatalism is for boys and child-free is for girls? We've skirted some of this already, but I think there is a real... I see them as being necessary to one another, but they're often two things that the community wants vastly pulled apart. And I think that sucks. but people disagree with me, so I'm very curious to know what you think about that.
Yeah. I'm not very familiar with the child-free movement, but from what I can follow on social media, for instance, projects like We Are Child-Free seem to focus more on the advantages being child-free would provide women. It seems to prioritize the women already in existence. Mostly there seems to be no ethical component to the idea, at least regarding the potential children. But the child-free movement has closely been intertwined with feminism from its beginnings. So I understand why it might cater to women. In Turkey, like I said, in most parts of the world, but maybe more so here, mothers end up being the primary and sometimes sole physical caregivers for the child. So I understand the motivation behind promoting a relatively carefree and satisfying lifestyle. that would appeal to women. But similar arguments could easily be geared towards men, I think, by addressing their concerns about being fathers, because there's also pressure on them to become fathers, not being real men if they're not fathers, or there are certain roles assigned to them related to fatherhood, like being the sole breadwinner, or whatever might feel challenging for them. And there are many studies about the negative impacts of fatherhood on men, particularly their mental health. And apparently, young men who want to have kids is also on the decline. But majority of those men, again, are not antinatalists. They don't want to, sort of child-free men, and they are, I guess. But then there are quite a few studies that seem to suggest that men aspire to fatherhood more than women aspire to motherhood. So that might be one of the reasons for the divide. So there's some conflicting information. I mean, we probably need more data. But if antinatalism appeals more to men, I mean, I haven't been aware of that, because child-free movement did not appeal to me, but rather antinatalism appealed to me from the beginning. And I mean, it wasn't a movement I could identify with, at least. Maybe you have mentioned it before too, but why do you think that is, really? Why do you think child-free is mostly for girls and antinatalism for boys?
I had Verena Brunschweiger, who's a German antinatalist and child-free activist and author. It's an amazing interview, and I asked her this question, and she talked about how she doesn't think that like antinatalism is too aggressive for a lot of women. There's a sort of a social cost to identifying as an antinatalist that is very sort of specific to women, where it's just too grave an offense, basically, socially. But child-free is more of there's more of a community around it. It's a softer kind of tone, and that I don't think that's necessarily the whole truth of why you see this divide, but I think that it's definitely part of it for some people. I think that's why we're seeing it. I also think that the antinatalist community does have some really aggressive elements. I think there is misogyny in antinatalism. There is definitely, I mean, there are incels in antinatalism. There's all kinds of things in antinatalism that are maybe not conducive to building a community of women within its ranks, or whatever, for lack of a better word. But at the same time, I mean, why we're seeing sort of the opposite in the child-free movement, I'm not entirely sure. I'm less connected to that world. I do definitely know some child-free men. They're also antinatalists. It's hard to find men that are just child-free and don't also cross over into antinatalism from my perspective anyway. But I think they are out there. I mean, there was a podcast called The Child-Free Girls. I was a guest there years ago, and they Lenora Faye, who's one of the Child-Free Girls, and Cody, I can't remember his last name, I apologize, had that for a couple of years now. They've put on this like big child-free convention online, and that has featured some really interesting like male child-free voices. There's all these competing voices in antinatalism, right? And a lot of people want it to just sort of be this academic thing, and there's all of this resistance to activism. And I think that the child-free movement feels a little bit more like activism. It feels more like sort of more a part of the real regular world and how it affects people's lives. And the antinatalism sort of coming into that is a bit of a scary prospect, because of what does antinatalist activism mean? What is that going to look like? How aggressive does that have the possibility of being? So I think it's contentious on a lot of different levels. But I also, underneath all, and I do see some of the relevant I mean, I do see some of the dangers that could come out of it, but underneath that, I also see like an incredible amount of good that can come from it. Like I just think antinatalism is such a powerful meme in the world. Like it has the possibility of doing all of this good, but it needs some of what the child-free movement is doing in order to actually
Mm-hmm.
mobilize it. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I just think there's a lot of fear around that. And but the reasons why that's articulates into a kind of gender divide, I think, is multifaceted, to say the least.
Mm-hmm.
More data is definitely needed. That is my long disorganized answer. So
Yeah, but you did point to a lot of possibilities. Yeah.
well, I sort of lied. One more thought on the gender divide, and then we'll move out. One thing I personally think could really help a lot of women become interested in antinatalism are more public voices like yours, voicing sentiments exactly like you did in Elizabeth's article. I don't think there is much space in the currently male-dominated antinatalist community for women to voice feelings about motherhood, mourning motherhood, struggling with a desire to have children. It's not a role that I can fill for people either. I'm genderqueer for one. I never wanted children. The idea of pregnancy, birth, like has always horrified me. So I guess that what I'm really trying to say is I sincerely thank you for your voice in this community. I think it is of vital importance. I truly do think you have the power to do a lot of good. So yeah.
Well, you certainly do more than your share of good, but thank you. I hope so. That would make me very happy. I do think, yeah, diversity of voices is quite important because you don't know what would really, who could appeal to whom, like just like in veganism. I always think, some people find some activists too aggressive or too lenient or too compromising, but then I think, well, they appeal to someone, you know. Um,
Exactly, and I've always been. That's why I try to keep a very wide tent as far as what antinatalism is. I try to keep the definition of antinatalism as wide as possible because I think we do have great diversity, and I think that that's one of our strengths, not one of our weaknesses, for sure. So I agree with you on that. So thank you so much. You've written a number of articles on antinatalism yourself, from what I understand. 4, if I'm not mistaken. All of them in bynet.org.
in a Turkish newspaper that is published online. Yes.
Yeah, and I took a look at all of them. They're all in Turkish, as you said. I did try to read them through Google Translate, although Google Translate wasn't helping me out too much. What can you tell me about these articles?
Um, I mean, they're mostly about all about the same thing, but I think after a while, I kind of started seeing antinatalism everywhere, just like I have always seen animal rights issues everywhere. Which, of course, I mean, you don't. It doesn't require much perceptiveness; they are everywhere. So I started writing about various intersections I encountered, like antinatalist themes in movies, in literature. Meaning of life, the issue of consent, um, why people have children, like surveys about why people have children, and why I think there are not good enough reasons for them to have children. I shared my own story about cancer and why I wanted to have a child, and then why I didn't have a child, and just essays about why it might not be a good idea to create new life. Because I mean, I'm writing them because I know the ideas resonate with some people, and it helps to write about them so that they're out there for anyone who reaches the same conclusions. But they do not know how to articulate their ideas. They don't know that it has a name or a term. But I think it's a way of paying it forward in my case. I mean, it really helped me when I read antinatalist works, um, and it makes you feel much less lonely, to see that there are other people out there. So yeah.
Excellent. Yeah, no, absolutely. I understand that in addition to being an antinatalist, you're also a vegan, as am I, and a passionate animal rights activist yourself, the coordinator of an animal rights studies center, and you also have your own podcast, the Right to Life Species podcast. I would love to learn more about these amazing projects. What can you tell me about them?
Yeah, gladly. The Animal Rights Center is founded in memory of a fellow animal rights activist and a conscientious objector, whom we lost at 32 years old 4 years ago. We organize workshops and events to bring together animal rights activists in Turkey. We have a scholarship program for undergraduate and graduate students who are engaged in vegan or LGBTQ plus activism, because there are no scholarship programs that are geared towards them, particularly in Turkey. We also organize protests, particularly with regard to the stray animal issue in Turkey. We support TNR, trap, neuter, and return, as it is stated in our law, but there are always problems in its implementation. There's always been. Frankly, it's the most frustrating of all we do, because it seems we've been trying to prevent stray animals from being killed or massacred since forever. There has been many attempts at this throughout the centuries in the Ottoman Empire as well as in Turkey. We frequently actually joke about using the exact same banners and slogans during the protest for the past 20 years, because not much has changed. We're always saying the same things. And we also have many cases of violence against animals, like court cases that we try to follow and inform the public about. The podcast is something that I recently started doing with a fellow vegan activist, Melike Dirikoç. And every other week, we talk about new studies on veganism, vegan activism, and we also have guest interviews about current issues in animal rights. And there's always a current issue in animal rights, particularly animal rights violations. So yeah, that's pretty much what we do.
Amazing work all around. That's really awesome. As I'm sure you know, one of the biggest debates in all of antinatalism has to do with the place of that animals hold within the philosophy. Some antinatalists are entirely anthropocentric. Their antinatalism is really only focused on human beings. But for some of us who are more ctiocentric or reverse biocentric persuasion, we think that the welfare of all life is deeply a part of what antinatalism is. And it compels us to do things like go vegan, perhaps do things like advocate for the end of factory farming, and even things like wild animal interventionalism and even sentient extinction. Where do you fall in all of this? And what are your thoughts on that anthropocentric versus ctiocentric divide in antinatalism?
Well, it's hard to imagine. I mean, it's also something I've thought about a lot. It's hard to imagine how anyone who is considered enough to think about potential suffering of human beings would be blind to suffering that already exists here and now, regardless of whether one is misanthropic or philanthropic in their approach to antinatalism. Because a misanthropic antinatalist should not be able to ignore the pain and suffering humanity is exposing non-human animals to, because allegedly they would be aware of how destructive we can be as a species. And a philanthropic antinatalist hopefully would be able to extend her compassion to all sentient beings, because, I mean, it sort of comes from compassion. I mean, in my idea, at least. But humans are complex, unfortunately, and irrational and inconsistent most of the time. So anthropocentric antinatalists do exist. Maybe, I mean, there are vegan mass murders too. I don't know. Like, I wonder if that can get that complex, or rather, vegans who hire assassins to spree kill other human beings, to make the analogy more accurate. I mean, I really try hard not to judge, because I'm always sure that there are things in my ideas or perspective that can be judged, and I'm not aware of them. And since as human beings we share the same kind of irrationality and blindness to our own faults, it makes me wonder sometimes. I wonder what you think about it. What we as ctiocentric antinatalists are missing. And maybe there are things we can do to be more consistent too. I mean, I cannot think of anything now because I'm blind to my own faults, but it is hard to believe we might be free of similar biases and prejudices of our own.
Oh, 100%. I think about that all the time. I mean, there always there seem I liken suffering to a Hydra, right? Like a Hydra is for anybody that doesn't know, is a monster with many heads. So it's like, and the heads keep growing back even though you cut them off. So it's like it's just a metaphor, meaning like you can keep considering all of these different heads of the Hydra, this monster of suffering, but there's always more heads. There's always more heads of this beast that you have to keep slaying. It just seems to be endless. It seems to be a bottomless pit. It seems to be a never-ending well of things to consider, of other beings that we might be trampling upon, we might not be giving enough consideration to. And I think that's I think that's something that any good ctiocentric antinatalist has to sort of contend with. I do think that we can only really consider what we have some agency over, or what we have some, I mean, if there's life on any elsewhere in the universe, I'm not an antinatalist that says that. There are antinatalists who say that we have some sort of like, we should intervene, with them, or but I just think that like we know what we have access to on Earth, or access is a strange word, but I'm just saying we know what we have in front of us, and that's sort of all that we can deal with, and that's the heaping pile of whatever that's on our plates, and that's what needs to be our focus. But yeah, I identify with that 100%. Another issue that antinatalists are incredibly divided on is the subject of extinction. Some ignore the subject entirely. Others go more of a transhumanist road. That's sort of another thing that sort of happened in more recent times. And others are pro-extinctionists. So where do you fall on this subject?
I'm pro-extinctionist. I mean, as much as I'm aware of it, there are no degrees in antinatalism, so I don't see how we could take another stance. All that could improve our life quality in the meantime is welcome, of course, unless it is based on experiments on animals, and unless it's about assisted reproductive technologies. If transhumanists, I'm not very familiar with transhumanism, but if transhumanists think extinction might not be inevitable if we somehow transcend our current limitations, I think we will have to reconsider the issue when the time comes, because as things stand now, I am pro-extinctionist, and I don't really think we have the duty to propose a long-term solution, because that's what people expect of antinatalists to do. We can't do it realistically either at this point. There are too many variables. I always get a follow-up question to this about veganism too. So how do you propose the world will go vegan? What will happen to all the cows or whatever? I mean, I might have answers to those questions, but I don't have to. Maybe those who are responsible should come up with a proposal as to how we will transition into a vegan world. So yeah.
No, I agree 100%. If I may, Mati, Hydra, and I end our new book, with the words, in regards to extinction, it is an aspiration, and I think that's really that really does sum it up. I think it is the way. I don't mean to speak for you here, but it is the way that we hope we hope that the world will close the curtain in this extraordinarily peaceful, thoughtful, compassionate manner. But how we get there, that's unfortunately not in our hands to have the answer to. So right now it's an aspiration. If it can become a reality, we can only really hope, I guess. I don't know if I've ever had the pleasure of speaking to an antinatalist from Turkey before. This is a rare treat for me on a variety of different levels. What is it like being an antinatalist in Turkey?
it might be slightly more challenging than being an antinatalist in developed countries, I guess. Because in countries like mine, like developing countries, there are always so many current issues that somehow any other issue seems to be a luxury. There are always imminent issues that require imminent solutions. So speaking about other things like animal rights or antinatalism, um, I mean, they're not frowned upon, but they're not taken seriously. You know, one might feel more of an outsider or considered to be more radical as opposed to, being in a Western country. But it is an unpopular opinion everywhere. So I would say it's not much more different. Our government of the past 20 years has a strong pro-natalist stance. And the president has encouraged all families to have at least 3 kids. In many instances, on at least one occasion, he actually said 5. But the past 20 years, actually, interestingly, saw a decrease in the fertility rate. And I think kind of remember the numbers from 2.38 to 1.6 something. That's below the replacement rate. Obviously, this is contingent on various circumstances. The reasons might be that life is becoming increasingly harder for all of us financially. Therefore, it is better not to create more life, or that life is increasingly becoming harder for all of us, and therefore we cannot afford an extra mouth to feed. So, but I don't think neither of them is necessarily antinatalist. I think, though, people have become more responsive to antinatalism in the last few years. I mean, as I said, personally, I've been quite privileged. I was free to make my own choices, form my own opinions. I've been financially independent. I wasn't forced into an arranged marriage, or I wasn't forced into having children. And I didn't have to conform to anyone's expectations. I mean, I'm sure I did, but in general, about marriage and reproduction, at least. So potentially being an antinatalist in Turkey might have been very difficult, but for me, it wasn't. Rest of the challenges are, I think, global challenges, like how to talk to your loved ones who do have children without offending them, how to grow a thicker skin for people who call you all sorts of things, and how to answer the exact same question again and again, because people always think their responses are very original, when they ask you a question. But all these probably sound very familiar to you too.
Sure, yeah, these are the issues that antinatalists have all over the world for sure. But it's always fascinating for me to hear, sort of what it's like in each part of the world, to be an antinatalist. I collect recordings of people saying the word antinatalism in different languages. May I ask, how do you say antinatalism in Turkish?
Antinatalism is the exact translation. Doğum karşıtlığı is the literal Turkish translation.
Okay, I have seen that, written. I think there's a user on Facebook and YouTube, if I'm not mistaken, who has that as his or her title. I'm not sure, but I've always wondered how to pronounce it. So thank you. That's great. There seems to be a lot of cool antinatalist things happening in Turkey. There was a fairly high profile interview with another Turkish antinatalist that I think I may have just mentioned. I apologize, I don't know their name. And there was another interview recently on 321 Media Productions. There was some kind of lecture recently. Somebody even did a Turkish translation of my movie, The Ethelist. Yeah. There was a recent Turkish podcast on the subject. There's also a Netflix show called Round of Applause, which is entirely in Turkish and apparently has some antinatalist themes. So that's really awesome. I mean, that's very unexpected to kind of see emerge. So are you familiar with any of these activities? Have you been involved with any of them? And just what are your thoughts on some of the stuff that's happening?
I've been contacted by some of them because of the translation of the book, but no, I haven't been involved directly with any one of them. I'm of course thrilled about them all. I hope discussions about antinatalism increase and reach a wider audience. One of the examples you mentioned, Round of Applause, certainly did reach a very wide audience. And I was shocked when I saw it for the first time, pleasantly shocked. It is a mini series which came out last month, I think. It was written and directed by a widely acclaimed film and theater director and producer. He was already very popular. Show is about a man who doesn't want to be born and spends his life wishing to return to his pre-birth non-existence. It has brilliant dark humor. That has a great script. I'm not sure if it's available everywhere in Netflix, but if it is, I certainly recommend all antinatalists and people who are interested in it to give it a try. I definitely want to write something about it. I mean, have you seen any character who is depicted visually in their mother's womb, smoking and pondering about not wanting to come to existence? I mean, I think it's brilliant. I just loved it so much.
Yeah, I have not seen any of it yet, but I'm dying to. And I actually didn't really realize that that was part of it. So I mean, I knew it had anti-natalist themes, but very little of the specifics. So yeah, that it's just fabulous. I absolutely can't wait to see it. Amazing. Well, I hope to see more awesome stuff like that, you know, coming out of Turkey and from everywhere in the world. So amazing. So now I'd love to spend some time talking about your translations, your remarkable translations of two of David Benatar's books, both Better Never to Have Been, as well as The Human Predicament. Would you mind saying the names of both of the books in Turkish? I'd love to know what that sounds like.
Yeah. Better Never to Have Been is Keşke hiç olmasaydık, var olmanın kötülüğü. And Human Predicament is İnsanın Çaresizliği.
Beautiful. Okay, thank you. I don't know of any other instance where the translator of these books has also been an antinatalist themselves. I'm really actually kind of curious if some of the others
And you would
might be.
know.
I would I? I don't know.
I think so.
I don't know. I
Well, if somebody knows, it would be you, I think.
Oh,
I
okay.
mean,
I see what you're saying.
I mean, you
Maybe.
have great research skills,
Oh, well,
really.
thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Well, I feel like I missed a big one though with you because like I was saying, I didn't know that you were actually an antinatalist until Elizabeth's article. So now I'm kind of feeling like I have to really fully dive into
Yeah.
all these other people that have done translations for sure. Were you familiar with antinatalism before taking on these projects? How did you come to be the translator of these books? And just what do you think about the work of David Benatar? How has his work impacted you personally?
Well, it's a long story, but I was 25. I was living in Germany at the time, and I started simply thinking about it, like having children might actually be evil. So that was my premise, you know. So I started doing some research online, and I was hoping to find other people and ideas out there who could articulate my sentiments better than the wish not to bring a child into such a horrible world. People would say this, right? But there was this implication that if the world was somehow in a better state, they would have biological children. And when I was researching, I came across the voluntary human extinction movement, and I really liked their motto, "May we live long and die out." It really resonated with me, but I thought something was missing because certainly the anthropogenic suffering of non-human animals is considerable, and that would be eliminated. But they would continue to suffer in various ways, even if we went extinct. So I wanted to take the animal world with me too as I left. So one of the related forums to voluntary human extinction movement referred to a book, which was, I think, at the time published a year earlier, and it was called Better Never to Have Been: The Harm of Coming into Existence. Many might find the title pessimistic, but I was so joyous when I saw the title for the first time. I wasn't sure what it contained, But if it actually argued for what the title promised, it meant that I wasn't alone and my fears and thoughts were actually legitimate. Professor Benatar, of course, delivers what he promises with the title and much more. And I think the way I can explain it is I think he gave me a language with which to express my ideas. I mean, that's the only way I can describe it. It taught me how to speak about what mattered to me the most. And for that, I'm very grateful to him. Sometimes I think everyone reaches like one major conclusion in their lives, and that determines the rest of what they think about everything else. That's what antinatalism is to me, to you too, I'm sure. So when I came back to Turkey, I waited for a few years, hoping that the book would eventually be translated with then at least with higher fertility rates than almost all EU countries. I thought Turkey definitely needed this perspective. I didn't want to translate it myself because I find translation very tedious, actually. And also because I wasn't sure I could manage, since Better Never to Have Been is not an easy text in its entirety. Then I mentioned it to a publisher who is also a friend, the chief editor in Doğu Batı Publishing in Turkey. And he told me they would publish it if I translated it. So I eventually did after thinking about it. And I'm very happy that I did.
It's an amazing story. It's an amazing story. And I did want to just also say that, yeah, it when I found antinatalism, it was like all of these disparate dots all of a sudden started becoming connected. Animal rights, atheism, the right to die, all of it, and all of this amorphous nonsense in my head just all of a sudden
Yeah.
Was a straight line. And it's an amazing feeling finding that. So that's really beautifully articulated by the influence that David Benatar had on you. Were you in communication with David Benatar at all during the translation process?
No, not at all. I wasn't.
And what was the most difficult aspect of translating these books?
Philosophical terminology. I'm not well versed in philosophy. I mean, I'm a reader of philosophy, but I'm not trained as a philosopher. And I had to make sure to find out the terms already translated into Turkish, philosophical terms, so that I would not make a fool of myself by trying to coin them again. Then there were sources Professor Benatar referred to, which had not been translated into Turkish yet. And then there were terms Professor Benatar coins and uses for the first time. So I think distinguishing between them and making sure they're accurate and precise enough without overwhelming the reader with footnotes was very challenging for me. I read all of his work on antinatalism. I read most of the responses to his arguments. And I also consulted some Turkish philosophers about some of the terms. Otherwise, I think Professor Benatar writes in a way which leaves no room for any misunderstandings. He has an impeccable foresight about possible misunderstandings and potential counter arguments, and he responds to all of them already. So, I mean, just as you're about to ask the question, the answer is there. I never read a sentence and thought it was ambiguous or elusive, not because they were simple, but because they were very well grounded and straightforward. Having said that, I was shocked to see how many people actually did misunderstand some of his fundamental arguments, or pretended to misunderstand. I'm not really sure, but that's another story.
Was the word antinatalism already established in Turkey before your translation? And also, I'm curious about the word promortalism. Was that another one that was sort of because he coined that term, as far as we know?
Yeah, no, they both were not being used, and we thought about whether to translate it literally or as it is, so that it would appeal to, like it would help if internationally they sound similar.
Yeah.
But we also thought about translating it literally, but we didn't in the end. We translated it as anti-natalism, which is similar to how it is.
So you're the origin, basically, of the Turkish usage of the word.
Well, I'm not 100% sure. Like maybe some people did mention it, and it was, but yeah, at least in a book, maybe.
Yeah, as far as we can tell. That's pretty awesome. I personally consider translation work to be one of the most important forms of antinatalist activism possible. Do you consider your work translating these books to be a form of antinatalist activism?
Well, I certainly hope that it would inspire people and and encourage them to inaction about reproduction. And it's an issue that should concern everyone. So even if that wouldn't be the translator's primary goal, I think translating works on antinatalism or veganism, for that matter, are forms of activism. We do it all the time for vegan activism. So, yeah.
Are there other books by Benatar or other antinatalist works by other people that you'd like to translate into Turkish?
I'm currently translating Second Sexism
Oh,
into
amazing.
Turkish. Yeah. But as I said, I really do not enjoy translation. I sometimes question the nature of translation itself. Like, I think maybe translation is not really possible. It might come naturally to some people, but I find it very difficult. So I would avoid it if I don't really enjoy a work and I think it would be good to have it in Turkish. I do think Jim Crawford's Confessions of an Antinatalist is very interesting and entertaining, and I do hope someone translates it, but it won't be me. I think it will appeal to a completely different readership. Then again, I didn't think I would translate any other book after Better Never to Have Been, but then The Human Predicament came out, and in some ways I enjoyed reading it even more than Better Never to Have Been. So I guess the answer is it depends on what Professor Benatar publishes next.
That's a fair answer. That's a fair. I would love to see. I don't think that Jim's book has been translated in any other language yet. I think I think only the English edition exists, as far as I'm aware. So I agree that would be a great one to. Well,
Yeah.
listen, I very much appreciate your work in translation. I'm sure there are many Turkish antinatalists who are very, very grateful to what you've done. So thank you so much. I've always been sort of fascinated by these translations of Benatar's works into other languages and the influence they may or may not be having on the cultures that they then have the chance to enter into. It's really hard not to wonder if your Turkish translations are a huge reason why we're starting to see more and more antinatalism coming out of Turkey, like with this Netflix show and other things. And you have been contacted in regards to some of this stuff, so it's very likely. I know that it's probably impossible to sort of quantify, but do you feel that your translations have sort of acted as a catalyst? What are your thoughts on the impact of your translations, your translation work on building Turkish antinatalism?
Yeah. You're right. It's hard to quantify. It has had Better Never to Have Been has had 3 print runs. It will have a 4th soon. I occasionally hear from readers about the impact it had on them. I think people would eventually hear about the idea, with or without the translation, and start producing art or scholarly work on antinatalism. In any case, I mean, it is good to know that there's a point of reference available in Turkish. I'm not sure if it acted as a catalyst because I don't think. I mean, translation is very helpful, of course, for a movement or an idea to travel, but antinatalism is such a strong idea that it would have traveled either way, I think.
And you might be very right about that, but I do think that you have done something very significant to help it along the way. So that shouldn't be discounted. Do you think that antinatalism will continue to be an important part of your work and life moving forward?
Certainly. I mean, I don't see how it cannot. It's part of my identity, and along with veganism, of course, I'll certainly continue writing and talking about them. And that's how I find meaning in life, you know, from an intellectual point of view, at least. Um, Sometimes non-vegans and pronatalists accuse activists for acting like religious fundamentalists, and activists understandably reject the label. But sometimes I do believe activism of relatively altruistic ideas do function similarly to religion, because they do provide meaning and comfort for me. And at least these two, like veganism and antinatalism, have a very universal dictum, like do no harm, right? I mean, that's what I always remind myself. And we are also trying to spread what we believe to be the truth, our truth. So yeah, I'm a believer in that sense.
And me as well. No, very well articulated. And absolutely. I mean, the antinatalism has given huge meaning to my life, and so I'm glad that it's the same for you, and I'm glad to hear that you will continue on. So you're translating the second sexism, and in addition to this, what's next for you? What else are you working on these days? Is there anything that you'd like to plug, and how can our audience best support what you do?
I think we've covered everything, and you provided all that I'm involved in. So I don't have anything to add. I guess I'll simply continue writing and talking about antinatalism and veganism, while also, I guess my priority is to look for new ways to talk about them, so as to make them more attractive to people. I'm trying some diplomacy nowadays. I think you've built something amazing for the antinatalist community. Or anyone who would like to learn about antinatalism. It's like a visual dictionary, annotated dictionary. This is a wonderful series of invaluable discussions. It really is. And I think all one can do is to share these conversations far and wide. And I'm very honored to be a part of this. So thank you, Amanda.
Cansu, the honor is all mine. Thank you so much for all of those extraordinarily kind and generous words. And thank you so much for being my guest today on the Exploring Antinatalism podcast. We so desperately need more voices like yours in antinatalism. So thank you so much for all that you do, all of your contributions. I think you've done some extraordinarily important work, and I can't wait to see what you do in the future. So once again, thank you so much for being my guest. It's been nothing but a pleasure.
Thank you. Pleasure's all mine.
Hey everybody, it's Amanda. Are you looking for an excellent way of making academic antinatalist works more available across the globe? I know I am. And so I'm delighted to announce that the wonderful and award-winning Polish publishing house,
Towarzystwo Naukowe imienia Stanisława Andreskiego,
which over the last 2 years has produced some exceptionally beautiful Polish editions of both original works like
Anti-natalism
by
Mikołaj Starzyński,
as well as classic academic antinatalist works like David Benatar's Better Never to Have Been, has now opened an online shop featuring the magnificent antinatalist Ouroboros designed by
Michał Dziadkowiec.
The logo is fully customizable and available on a wide variety of products. Proceeds from all sales at the shop go directly towards the translation, production, and publication of more Polish editions by
Towarzystwo Naukowe imienia Stanisława Andreskiego.
What a perfect way for the antinatalist community to help assist an amazing company doing such important work, making more antinatalist academic works more widely available. Link below.
Towarzystwo Naukowe imienia Stanisława Andreskiego.
Hi, my name is Nimrod, and about 10 months ago, I decided that I want to try and initiate grassroots anti-natalism activism in Israel, because this is where I was forced to be born. The activism is going better than I expected, so I thought that if it's working in a place like Israel, it sure can and should work around Europe. And besides, why should only people in Israel hear my nagging about reproduction?
כשאנחנו מולידים מישהו, שאנחנו עושים ילד, מה שאנשים קוראים, אין לנו שום דרך לשלוט בזה שהחיים שלו יהיו טובים, ושהוא ימצא את החיים שלו ראויים כשהוא יהיה גדול, או דברים יכולים לקרות בכל רגע נתון. ההחלטה הכי קריטית בחיים של מישהו, לא הוא קיבל. No, but it's not about balance, it's about suffering. Why should anyone suffer? את יכולה לחוות הורות בלי ליצור בן אדם חדש, לאמץ. שזה פתרון מדהים בעיניי, מאוד יפה מוסרית. I'm not playing God. People who procreate play God. They create new life. I don't create new life. I'm standing here with signs. People are creating new life, and they are creating a new victimizer, someone who would cause suffering to others. 10 אנשים נולדים, 9 יהיו מאושרים, 1 יהיה אומלל, אבל כל 10 לא יסבלו מזה שהם לא יהיו קיימים. כי הם לא קיימים, יפה. אז בשביל האחד הזה שיהיה אומלל, לא שווה שה9 יהיו קיימים.
Therefore, from the 15th of April and until the end of May, I will be going around Europe to talk to people about reproduction, spreading the word about antinatalism. Madrid, Barcelona, Paris, Brussels, Vienna, Prague, Berlin, Copenhagen, Stockholm, Budapest, Rome. And all in all, I will be visiting more than 30 cities in 45 days, starting from the 15th of April until the end of May. The goal of this journey is to try and initiate some anti-natalism grassroots activism in Europe. So I really hope that as many anti-natalists as possible would join me to these outreach events. If you are passionate about anti-natalism and I'm coming to your city, please join me. Together, we'll spread the word and normalize anti-natalism.
Thank you for listening to the Exploring Antinatalism Podcast. Please follow the podcast on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. Exploring Antinatalism can also be heard on Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Buzzsprout, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Amazon.com, and so many other platforms. You can email me at exploringantinatalism@gmail.com. Website designed by Visions Noirs. Please follow him at www.bionoir.com and follow him on Instagram. Logo art by Life Sucks. Please subscribe to him on YouTube and check out his shop on Etsy at www.etsy.com/shop/LifeSucksPublishing. Music by Mati Hydra. You can hear the whole song, Life is a Sexually Transmitted Disease with a Mortality Rate of 100%, by following the link in the description, and make sure to also read his academic paper which inspired the song, If You Must Give Them a Gift, Then Give Them the Gift of Non-Existence, in the Cambridge Quarterly of Healthcare Ethics on cambridge.org. Links below. All the best, and bye for now.
Life is no thrill compared to nil. Life is no thrill. It's worse than nil. So draw the right conclusion. Let them be still.